So hopefully this lecture will help address any confusion you have around the role of mayors, metro mayors and Lord mayors, okay? And also the role of the Mayor of London as a legally distinct body or position that shouldn't be directly compared with metro mayors, or indeed definitely not compared with executive mayors or directly elected mayors. So throughout this lecture and this module probably, I will use the term mayors for mayors of a council. I will use metro mayor to refer to the mayor of a combined authority, the Mayor of London for the Mayor of London, and then obviously Lord Mayors as ceremonial positions that we typically don't talk about. So the difference between mayors and metro mayors. So here we need to look a little bit at legislative history. The role of elected mayors was created with the Local Government Act 2000, which required local authorities to shift from their traditional committee-based system of decision-making to an executive model. The options for executive models were 1. A directly elected mayor, subject to approval by a referendum, with a cabinet of ruling party group members. 2. A council leader and cabinet executive, so the parliamentary system. A mayor and council manager executive, which was abolished in 2007. And an alternative arrangement as agreed by the Secretary of State, including a committee system. But this fourth option was normally only open to shire districts with populations of fewer than 85,000. So not really one to concern yourselves about. Part 3 of the Local Government and Public Involvement in Health Act amended the 2000 legislation. The directly elected mayor model was unchanged, but the mayor and council manager model was abolished. So local electorates, just so you know, there are, later we'll look at images that outline all these different models, so don't worry if you're a bit kind of lost. Okay. Local electorates had the right to petition for the creation of a directly elected mayor since the Local Government Act 2000, and a minimum threshold for a valid petition is 5% of local government elected registered in the local authority's area. You get 12 months to collect these signatures, so the bar is very low. However, the Localism Act 2011 permitted central government to trigger referendums for elected mayors, which might lead you to ask just how localist it is. And this was intended to happen in the largest cities during 2012, which was meant to be a big bumper year for the creation of mayors. Of the 12 cities which held a referendum, well, first of all, actually, Leicester City Council and Liverpool City Council exercised their option to have a directly elected mayor without a referendum. And of the 12 cities which held a referendum on creating a mayor, only one voted in favour to adopt it, and that was Bristol. And one other decided to retain their mayor in Doncaster, and turnout was low, from a quarter to a third of voters. On the other hand, metro mayors were created much later. They were created by the Cities and Local Government Devolution Act 2016. And so combined authorities were older than metro mayors. They were introduced outside Greater London in 2009 by the Local Democracy, Economic Development and Construction Act. So every metro mayor needs to lead a combined authority, but not every combined authority has a metro mayor. So the powers of mayors are consummate with the kind of local authority for which they are the executive, i.e. local authority mayors do not have any powers, any special powers, beyond what a council leader would have. Their powers are completely dependent on the type of authority they lead. There is no extra bonus of having a mayor in that sense. These powers, which are held by mayors and council leaders alike, are described as either exclusive powers or co-decision powers, and are defined in the Local Government Functions and Responsibilities England Regulations 2000. So co-decision powers are those that the mayor or the leader shares with the council, notably the power to make the local authority's annual budget and its policy framework documents. To amend or reject a mayor's proposal for any of these documents, the council must resolve to do so by a 2/3 majority. Exclusive powers are less easy to define because they consist of all the powers that are granted to a local authority by an Act of Parliament, except those that are defined either as co-decision powers or as not to be the responsibility of an authority's executive. So it's essentially a residual category. The key point, though, and the only thing you kind of need to remember for this section, is that mayors and council leaders have the same powers. Now, where there is some difference is in terms of council organisation. An elected mayor in a mayor and cabinet system has the power to appoint up to 9 councillors as members of a cabinet and to delegate powers either to them as individuals or to committees. In practice, the mayor remains personally accountable, so most mayors have chosen to delegate to a very limited extent, if at all. Local authorities in Britain remain administered by a permanent staff of chief officers led by a chief executive or chief operating officer, who are meant to be politically neutral bureaucrats. Their powers remain unaffected by the introduction of an elected mayor. However, the Mayor of London has completely different powers to the mayor and cabinet leaders and should be considered unique. On the other hand, the powers of metro mayors are much less clear-cut, right? The directly elected metro mayors are responsible for setting out strategies for growing the city region economy and will have certain powers over housing, transport and skills. Previously, the majority of these powers lay with either individual local authorities, such as planning or local transport decisions, or with national decision makers, such as the adult skills budget administered through the Skills Funding Agency. Exactly what the metro mayors are able to do is determined by the individual deals that each city region has agreed with the government. Due to different capacities, appetites, abilities to deliver, and needs, the deals vary in size and scope across different city regions. The majority of city regions are focusing on gaining powers over skills, housing and transport. Greater Manchester has negotiated these powers but also has agreed devolution over more powers of criminal justice and health and social care compared to other areas. Over time, the power of the metro mayors are hugely likely to increase, as has happened in London. But the devolution bill is deliberately non-prescriptive. It is an enabling piece of legislation that allows for the devolution of almost anything to a local level, should a Secretary of State allow it. Now, the limit to the level of devolution under this model is the willingness and ability of national politicians and local politicians to reach an agreement on what can and should be devolved. And what should be clear from this is that the public have no say whatsoever. Local government in England has 2 distinct aspects. First, there is the world of elected representatives, party politics, policy making, public and private discourse and debate, the seeking of party advantage and desire to secure a governing mandate from the local citizenry. So the local council provides the main institutional setting for this process. Secondly, there's a complex set of institutional arrangements driven by managerial and technocratic concerns and aimed at the provision of important public services which, while needing to respond to local priorities and concerns, need to meet national standards and considerations. And so local government is the means by which the provision of local services is brought together with the world of politics, right? And party politics in particular. The rediscovery of the democratic and representative elements of local government under New Labour is arguably, anyway, one of the most powerful changes that has occurred in local government in recent times. It's led to a debate about what local political leadership is, how it should be configured and conducted, and also has given politicians in a locality a greater voice in the media and on the kind of national political stage. Now, one key debate is obviously how citizens should select their local political leaders, either directly at an authority-wide election, the mayoral method, or by an indirect choice made for by the voter, by local councillors of the majority party on the council. As I've said numerous times before, and a lot of you have picked up on in seminar discussions, this has huge parallels with the parliamentary and presidential kind of debates. Now, despite councillors being elected as politicians with a clear political vision and more often than not a party label, they have not generally been expected by government or the public to provide local political leadership to communities. Rather, they've been faced with the challenge of providing important and complex services, making decisions about the nature of that provision within strict government guidelines, and they've been the vehicle through which the quality of those services and the officers running them are held to public account. And so, to that end, at least, Service delivery has been the story of local government. Local leadership has not. And a vital element about the debate around local political leadership is whether a political body such as a council be organised as a collective uniform whole, responsible for all facets of political decision making, or whether there should be a separation of the executive and representative functions and processes of local government. So in 1967, the Maud Committee reported that the long-standing committee system within local government should be replaced by a management board of 5 to 9 councillors, which would have control of the policy process and the formation of the council's objectives. The Maud Committee based its suggestions on the need for the provision of clear political leadership at a local level, something which the introduction of a directly elected mayor and executive council leaders was designed to facilitate some 30 years after Maud reported. The Widdicombe Committee recognised the advantages of the type of management committee of members that Maud had proposed and shared its enthusiasm for this approach to enhancing accountability and decision making. However, the committee was concerned about concentrating power in too few hands and reducing the influence of councillors outside the executive. There was a concern that direct election of the executive could lead to conflict between two separate governing bodies with competing mandates, i.e. the mayor and the council, and that deadlock could occur, or worse still, an intense political battle develop around which element of government had the strongest mandate. In addition, the personalisation of politics, seen as inherent in the mayoral system and accepted in countries with a presidential system, was thought to be generally disliked in Great Britain, although it's important to note there was no polling done to back this up. Finally, there was a concern expressed that if the council and the mayor had different electoral cycles, the prospect could emerge of the mayor and council majority coming from a different party. This was seen as a recipe for gridlock. Again, it's all of the arguments that we've seen for the presidential parliamentary systems. In the 1990s, the Commission for Local Democracy argued that most local government in Western Europe at the time was based on a form of separation of local powers and consisted of an elected assembly or council, an executive group or committee, and the permanent staff serving either of the political elements. It suggested such a separation of powers in Britain would overcome public confusion, secrecy and inefficiency. The Commission for Local Democracy suggested a weak mayoral model, where the directly elected leader or mayor would head the council administration. The office and its holders should be subordinate to the council, though, which would retain control of the budget and broad policy matters. Thus, the mayor would be required to negotiate with the council on a range of issues. So, the idea of a new executive structure for local government had been around for a long time, previous to New Labour's Local Government Act. Now, by the time of New Labour, the committee system was seen as a product of a bygone age and was no longer suited to modern or modernised local government and to dealing with the complex network of governance arrangements, of which the elected council was just a part. So essentially, the committee system was not fit for an era of governance. Certain key assumptions underpinned New Labour's modernisation agenda. So the first is that there is a need to separate into distinct bodies the executive, representational and scrutiny roles of the council. Second, that the key role of the council and the councillor is to provide political leadership to the community. Third, the councils are required to navigate a complex and uncertain world of governance based on working in partnership with other public and private bodies. Fourth, the political leadership and decision making should be transparent, open, visible and responsive to citizens' concerns. And fifth, engagement between citizens and council is vital and rests on councils employing a broad range of consultative and participatory mechanisms. Now think about how this ties in with the concept of narratives we looked at a few weeks ago. Are these claims empirically testable, or are they based on an assumption or an a priori world view, right? That is it a hunch, is it a narrative, or is it actually fact? Either way, the committee system of political decision-making was condemned on all counts. The committee system operated through, unsurprisingly, committees of ward councillors. The most common arrangement was that the decisions of these committees were then approved at the next meeting of the council, though, in some councils, particularly the larger authorities, the power to make those decisions was delegated to the committees themselves, and there were always special powers under which the decisions that required urgent action could be taken by senior officials in collaboration with the chair of the committee. Detailed decisions could often be made by officers even when not urgent, so that committees were not overwhelmed by a huge number of decisions. So the committee system clouded political responsibility, and committee chairs, a vital part of the council's political leadership, were often anonymous to the public. They were chosen by party committees or meetings, and so they were seen as quite distant. Committees had failed to foster community leaders and leadership, and local people had no say over their local leaders. Political leadership and the scrutiny of those leaders was argued to be distinct and separate concepts and roles, requiring politicians that specialised in one or the other. Improved accountability and scrutiny would be an automatic result of the separation of political roles and responsibilities, it was argued, as those councillors who played no direct part in the decisions taken will have a clear, explicit responsibility to review and question those decisions, whether or not they belong to the same party as the executive. Although I'd suggest that was quite a naive understanding of how party politics in the UK works. The separation of roles and ultimately the separation of local political powers would produce greater clarity about who is responsible for decisions and who should be held accountable for them. However, culture is also an important factor here. Introducing a requirement on councillors to hold an executive to account, even if it consists of party colleagues, is one thing. Changing long-established and well-understood patterns of political behaviour among councillors is quite another. And there is little evidence to suggest that party group loyalty has been relegated to second place behind the need to hold an executive to account, especially if promotion through party ranks requires loyalty to a party leader, who also is the mayor, for instance. In the 1998 white paper, Modern Local Government, In Touch with the People, the government elaborated its case for a local separation of powers and argued that such separation would enhance efficiency, transparency and accountability in local government. Efficiency would come via a small executive, particularly where individuals have executive powers. It was argued they can act more quickly, responsively and accurately to meet the needs and aspirations of a community. Transparency, well, it would be clear to the public who is responsible for those decisions. The scrutiny process will help to clarify both the reasons for decisions and the facts and analysis on which policy and action are based. And accountability. Increased transparency will enable people to measure the executive's actions against the policies upon which it was elected. Councillors will no longer have to accept responsibility for decisions in which they took no part, which in theory should sharpen local political debate and increase interest in elections to the council. In reality, do voters notice a difference, or do they think, oh, Labour mayor, let's tar all Labour councillors with the same brush? Similarly, are local councillors able, do they have the time and the resources to effectively scrutinise the whole range of decisions made by the executive? Well, these are questions that obviously vary from area to area, but if we're going to have basically voluntary people filling this role, the role of councillor, then we need to ask whether they have the skills and the resources available to actually fulfil their scrutiny roles. Otherwise, you're just giving a lot of power to the head of a party leader, which isn't necessarily the best way to run a local government unit. So the three options for the form of local government executive was set out in the 2000 Act, two of which involved the directly elected mayor. The change to one of these systems was mandated for all large authorities, i.e. those over 85,000 people. These options appear to have emerged from a series of discussions between senior politicians and friendly sources, rather than any serious or fundamental review of different approaches to executive mayors or how local authorities are run overseas, for example. The three options are available to all county, district and unitary authorities in England, although at the moment only district and unitary and London Borough Councils have mayors. No county council does, to my knowledge. So figure 1 shows directly elected mayors. This is the directly elected mayor and cabinet. The mayor is elected at an at-large election by all local voters. They then appoint a cabinet from among members of the council to a maximum of 10 members in total, including the mayor. A vital element of the introduction of the mayoral political executive into English local government is the notion of consent. Therefore, before an elected mayor can be introduced as a executive for any council area, originally, as we said, a referendum must be held. Now, as we said, the referendum can be initiated by the council itself or by public petition, or the Secretary of State can direct the council to hold a referendum on the introduction of an elected mayor. If the minister feels like the council has ignored public consultation. From the outset, it was made clear that the elected mayor is to be treated as a councillor for the purpose of any legislation, is subject to the same rules of qualification for and disqualification from being elected, is covered by the same ethical framework and code of conduct as all councillors, and is to be included as part of his or her party group in the calculation of the proportional allocation of any kind of committee seats or things like that. Secondly, we have the indirectly elected leader, the council leader method, or model rather. And the second executive option sees the leader appointed by a whole council, with the cabinet appointed either by the leader or by the council as a whole. Now, under the Local Government Act, a mayor can select his or her cabinet without reference to the council, whereas the council can grant the council leader the power to select a cabinet, or it can appoint one itself. Informally, this all depends on the kind of internal power dynamics of the council and its ruling group. A politically weak council leader could be forced to accept a certain cabinet by their own party outside of council meetings. The mayor cannot have a cabinet membership imposed on him or her to suit the demands of the majority group, unless they kind of so ask. And then you have a mayor and council manager, which was the least popular. Here the executive consists of only two members, the directly elected mayor and a council manager, with the former giving political leadership to the latter. The council manager role represents a form of super chief executive to whom strategic policy and day-to-day decision-making are delegated. The mayor is the political figurehead, giving guidance and leadership rather than direct decision-making, and exerting influence over the council manager, who is appointed by the council. Figure 1.3 displays the mayor and manager options set out by the government. This model at present has only been adopted in Stoke. All other mayors fit the first option outlined. It was abolished as an option, though, in 2007, as I said. For Corpus, in creating a carefully structured and limited approach to the three executive options open to local councils and to citizens, the government had missed an opportunity to allow councils to borrow ideas about mayoral political leadership from overseas and to allow a marketplace of ideas of how to govern communities to be fostered. The Localism Act, as mentioned, allowed for committee structures to be reintroduced. And on the next slide, you'll see just some differences between mayors and leaders. So the areas that tend to have mayors tend to be urban areas, and they tend to be run by Labour. You can see that they're not overwhelmingly popular. And this example, that image there, is Hangus the monkey, who was the official mascot of Hartlepool United and won the first Hartlepool mayoral election in 2002, and then was re-elected twice before the position was abolished, and he ran on a position of free bananas. So not everywhere takes these elections as seriously as they perhaps should. So London, as always, is different. The abolition of the Greater London Council in 1986 and the transference of its responsibilities to London boroughs, as well as to an array of other bodies created especially, left the capital without a strategic layer of governance, something it had not lacked one way or another since 1855. There is a parallel in the reform of London government and the rest of the country, namely the separation of executive functions into a distinct political entity to be held to account by those outside the executive. In London, or like the rest of the country, mayoral accountability was to be assured by a separate organisation altogether, the London Assembly. The Mayor and the Assembly together comprised the Greater London Authority. The GLA was then to work in partnership with a range of external agencies to provide the capital with good governance, visible political leadership, a political decision-making arrangement that was transparent, inclusive and responsive, and clear lines of accountability. The Assembly has 25 members who were elected using the additional member system of proportional representation. Elections take place every 4 years alongside mayoral elections. There are 14 constituencies, each electing one member, with a further 11 members elected from a party list to make the total number of members from each party proportional to the votes cast. A party must win at least 5% of the party list in order to win any seats. Thus, the new governance of London would look radically different from the rest of local government and have a configuration of political relationships fundamentally different to those that exist elsewhere. So the GLA was not to be a traditional authority providing services like, say, Liverpool City Council. Rather, it was to sit within a network of overlapping responsibilities, and its influence was to be shared with a number of other statutory bodies and non-statutory bodies, with GLA members making up part of the membership of, and sometimes taking the chairs of, a range of organisations concerned with the governance of London. The GLA's relationships with the voluntary sector, central government and the London Borough Councils were to vary according to the task and partnerships in hand. Unlike with non-London English mayors, in forming a cabinet, the Mayor of London has a much wider choice available. Their cabinet appointments are not limited to a member of the GLA, so they can basically choose whoever they want. The final thing to note is that the London Mayor was established under the Greater London Authority Act 1999 and thus has different powers to metro mayors and to mayors. Alright, so we spent a lot of time talking about mayors, but do they actually make a difference? Well, the shift from indirectly to directly elected leaders coincides with a shift from notions of local government to local governance, as well as with a move from hierarchical and closed government networks and a routinized policy structure to a more fragmented and decentralized set of local political networks, coupled with experiments in new forms of democracy. The latter type of system of local governance over government requires a more personalized system of political leaders, one in which accountability and responsibility for political action or inaction can be readily focused on an individual. Yet related to the forces for change to a directly elected political leader is the question of whether a simple shift in the way local political leaders operate or are selected is sufficient to enable them to respond effectively to rapidly changing local and national political environments. Copus argues that the perceived and actual increases in political legitimacy and the greater political recognition of a directly elected mayor compared with those of an indirectly elected political leader do enhance their ability to deal with the challenges that they face. However, such enhanced legitimacy cannot substitute for actual political power. English mayors are hard-pressed to meet such high expectations, as they are within a legislative framework with little institutional and political capacity to act as actual leaders, right? Nor does the legislative framework provide elected mayors with significant distinctions when compared with their council leader counterparts, other than perhaps, say, the direct election, and thus a mandate. For Greatley and Stoker, institutional design does make a difference and can encourage leadership practices of a political style and form. The mayoral structure for Greatley and Stoker shows signs of supporting a more facilitative leadership style compared to the more widespread council leader model. They use the concept of facilitative leadership, which is closely related to local governance. Facilitated leadership constitutes a different way of exercising power and influence, whereby effective urban governance is achieved through building civic cooperation across institutional boundaries, steering, not commanding. Okay. The previous more formal understanding of power as the exercise of detailed influence or control over decision making gives way to a more informal understanding The power is about giving direction and then mobilising the resources necessary to ensure vision is fulfilled. Greasley and Stoker argue that mayors are perceived to offer more effective partnership relations. The councils they lead are perceived to be better at dealing with cross-cutting policy issues that require input from a range of partners, and they are seen as generally having better relationships with partners. Where mayors fall down, but so too do council leaders, they argue, is in the extent to which non-executive councillors, backbenchers, feel engaged in the policy process. Mayors, their field work suggests, do have effective working relationships with the councillors who join them in the cabinet, and so do many council leaders, but neither form of executive organisation, appears to encourage greater engagement with the wider body of councillors. And so on a local level, that is perhaps a missed opportunity. Neither form has provided or proved able, rather, to fully overcome ingrained barriers to transparency. Moreover, the mayor is seen as a higher profile leader. The mayoral system appears to have a reputation for speedier decision making and a stronger leadership role. And the evidence suggests that because of their higher profile, mayors may be able to galvanise more and generate a more engaged response from the public, although that response is not necessarily always positive. Mayoral authorities also get credit for being seen as less dominated by partisan politics than leaders in other systems. Greasley and Stoker find that in mayoral authorities, less time is spent by mayors sustaining party politics, and that most mayors have made a concerted effort to place themselves beyond partisan politics to a degree. Why is this? Well, for Greasley and Stoker, it's down to structural factors. They argue that constitutions cannot determine a leadership style, but they can make certain leadership styles more likely. Plainly, not all mayors are as successful as one another, and not all will display the qualities of urban leadership that have been identified as perhaps those most appropriate to face the demands of the 21st century. Moreover, some leaders in the leader cabinet model will display those characteristics of leadership style, but constitutional change can work by giving players a new set of constraints and incentives which steer their behaviour. Mayors face fewer internal constraints and veto points, so they can enter the arena of negotiating with partners, other agencies and citizens from a stronger base. They are not all powerful, but they are not so prone to being enfeebled as local councillors as council leaders can be. As such, they are freer to develop an outward-looking facilitative leadership style. Added to this is the certainty encouraged by a 4-year term, which encourages mayors, compared to council leaders, to develop long-term strategic agendas. Ultimately, mayors rely on the public judging their behaviour favourably, and so they are encouraged to look outward for approval. This, however, may fall in tension with yearly elections. There is still a party political element to this, and a Labour mayor would not want to see Labour councillors lose seats. Similarly, Labour mayors, or at least party mayors, party candidates for the mayoralty, are still selected by their parties before they're selected by voters. So party politics does still play a role. The constitutional position of the mayor leads, through the powers and relationships that is set up, to a push for a mayor to adopt the more facilitative leadership style. Headlam and Hepburn look at the case of Liverpool's first and, currently only, directly elected mayor Joe Anderson, who was also the council leader before becoming mayor. By looking at Joe Anderson's diary when he was council leader and when he was mayor, they aim to explore whether the role of mayor is undertaken in a different manner to that of council leader. They found that the mayor has started to spend a smaller proportion of his time in the day-to-day activities they classified as city management than he did as council leader, and more than half his time representing the city at various meetings and functions. Increasingly, he's also spending less time on Labour Party-related activity than he did as council leader. Further, the mayor chose to allocate a greater proportion of his time to meetings at city, region and national level than he did as council leader. And there's a similar but less marked pattern with meetings as civic actors and business people. However, Headlam and Hepburn warn that within a short space of time, Joe Anderson has had to draw on a different set of behaviours, appropriate for a representative more than a party politician or city manager. To do this, he has had no training, very little support, and he doesn't even have a job description. The mayor has a mandate from the electorate and very little else to support him in carving out a completely new role. They speculate that this might help explain the recent media attention on the financial mismanagement at Bristol City Council, one of the first English councils to experiment with a directly elected mayor. What we can see overall, though, is the rescaling of the efforts of the mayor away from neighbourhood or ward level concerns upwards towards national and international activities. Now, for Headlam and Hepburn, this is problematic in the context of appeals towards localism. This policy innovation is to shift concentrations of power further away from ward and neighbourhood concerns. However, it might also help local authorities reach out and be less insular or inward-looking. Now, the article by Hepburn and Headlam is well worth reading. It's really, really good and really innovative methodologies. It's on the recommended reading, so I would really, really recommend that you do it. So metro mayors are an innovation, and they differ obviously from Lord mayors and the local authority mayors. Unlike local authority mayors, they enjoy powers devolved from central government in some respects, and also powers brought up from local authorities. They're in part a response to the English question, right? The idea that Scottish MPs can vote on issues that affect England, but English MPs can't vote on issues that affect just Scotland because of devolution. The day after Scotland rejected independence in the 2014 referendum, David Cameron announced new powers for devolved bodies in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, but he also said it's important we have wider civic engagement about how to improve governance in our United Kingdom, including how to empower our great cities. But as always, there was no talk of devolution for England as a political unit, because that seems absolutely beyond the pale. But it's okay to chuck a few powers to some big cities in a kind of ad hoc manner. Metro mayors also differ from the Mayor of London in that they are not subject to scrutiny by a directly elected assembly, as with the Greater London Authority, and they tend to enjoy perhaps a wider range of powers in some areas. Their exercise of powers, however, is subject to scrutiny by an overview and scrutiny committee consisting of backbench councillors from the constituent authorities. The metro mayors are required to work with a cabinet, which they chair, comprising the leaders of the combined authorities, and they cannot alter the personnel of the cabinet without the council leaders' consent. The metro mayors are the product of devolution deals between the combined authorities and the government, negotiated separately on a bilateral basis with each combined authority. The powers of combined authorities are derived not from local but from central government. Each deal yields its own set of statutory powers which differ from area to area. But the most important power enjoyed by the new mayors is not on the statute book at all. For these mayors, like the mayors of London, will be regarded as spokespeople for their areas, even over matters which they have no statutory responsibility. With an electoral mandate behind them, the metro mayor can mobilise public opinion and speak for local electors in a way in which the traditional council leader could not. So why push for metro mayors? Well, the arguments go they are at the right scale for the issues they're dealing with. They cover functional economic areas, what we term city regions, rather than a single local authority. This matters because if you want to achieve real change in public services and local economic growth, it often means working at a scale beyond a single local authority. These mayors are meant to be leaders of place and not leaders of councils. And similarly, if you're trying to sort, say, transport in an area, well, transport does not end where a local authority boundary does, right? People will travel from within these functional areas, these functional economic areas. That's what makes them functional economic areas. And so it makes sense on some level to treat them all as one unit. Metro mayors are also seen to be visible and accountable. Local people will know who they are, and they'll be recognised on the national stage and will be taken seriously by national politicians and civil servants. The issue they're dealing with, urban development, regeneration, levelling up, will be dealt with by a clearly accountable politician. We see this with Andy Burnham at Greater Manchester. There's also an idea that they'll be outward facing in their leadership, so mayors will be able to go on trade missions, acting as figureheads for attracting inward investment for bigger areas that looks more impressive, right? So the 1.5 million people in the Liverpool city region compared to, say, the 500,000 people in Liverpool. They're also able to wield soft power. They'll have far better access to secretaries of state than most backbench MPs do, and they'll have the power to convene local public service leaders to sort out problems that require coordination, using the power of their mandate. They're the best chance to date of ensuring that devolution is sustainable over time. Mayors will start with powers over transport, further education, business support, the kind of methods to get people off benefits and into work, and in the case of Manchester, some powers over health and social care. But as has happened with London, they're likely to get more powers over time. And we've seen candidates campaign on issues they don't have the formal powers to solve yet. All of this will help get buy-in from political elites into devolution and help embed these combined authorities within the kind of governance frameworks in the area that they operate in. And hopefully they will encourage better quality and more experienced politicians to stand. 3 London mayors were established figures before becoming mayors. In Liverpool, Steve Rotherham defeated Luciana Berger, who were both MPs, and the mayor of Liverpool City, Joe Anderson, to win the Labour nomination. Whilst the West Midlands Labour nomination was won by a former MP, the Sheffield City region is led by a former MP, Dan Jarvis. Andy Burnham is obviously former MP, former Health Secretary. Andy Street in the West Midlands is, a former big business manager, right? So, these attract good candidates. However, there are also downsides. It overloads, potentially, individual actors. A metro mayor cannot cover all the functions of a local authority, right? And they also have to rely on a lot of unaccountable personal assistance, or else power slips to full-time chief officials. There's also an argument if there's little space for differing or opposing voices. So, for example, a single person from one party is unlikely to represent the diverse complexities of large urban metropolitan areas. Andy Street, for example, became the Conservative Mayor of the West Midlands with 50.4% of the vote on a second round, but has 100% of the power of the Metro Mayor. Arguably, the 49.6% have no voice in the office of Metro Mayor. You might not think that's a convincing argument. I'm not massively sure that I'm sold on it either, because there are still alternative centres of power in the local authorities, right? And metro mayors have to work with them. They have to often take council leaders with them on what they're trying to do. And then also settling disputes in cabinets encourages coordination of policy, which arguably could be better achieved horizontally amongst colleagues than vertically by one person from above. So in the case of metro mayors, there's a cabinet, but executive powers stay with the metro mayor. And in combined authorities, these cabinets include a group of leaders of the component authorities who are likely to be fully occupied with, issues in their own authorities, even with their own cabinets, and therefore the extent to which they can be a check on the power of metro mayors is questionable. And then there's also the accountability to other actors is blurred. So we might have a focus on personality rather than policy or track record, focus on building one's own media profile, perhaps for a return to the Commons, and perhaps all this talk of reform diverts away from more serious issues such as the austerity that local government has faced, and that perhaps undermines its ability to do things, to do the bread and butter of what local government should be doing. Finally, there's the question of how much of the local economic growth that metro mayors say, if they do bring it in, how much benefits that local area in terms of tax revenues raised, rather than going into national coffers as well.